Marvel Snap's newest card is Proxima Midnight. I have 5 increasingly weird decks for you to try. Proxima Midnight is a 4-cost 7-power unit that goes onto your board when it is discarded at your lowest power location. This means that she has obvious discard synergies, and so most of these decks are going to focus around the discard archetype because that is what gets to run her effectively as a free 7-power unit. So we'll start with the basic level. This is the safe Proxima Midnight deck. This is the basic discard deck built around using a MODOK on turn 5, and your MODOK on turn 5 is going to do a variety of things for you. It'll get you that free Proxima Midnight. It'll get you that obviously slightly more powerful than usual Wolverine. It'll get you an Apocalypse proc. It'll get you some Swarms. And the rest of the discards in your deck are targeted, which means that you are not going to run the risk of getting rid of the wrong cards, or most importantly, getting rid of that MODOK. The main issue that running non-targeted discard like Corvus Glaive in a deck like this has is that you run the risk of discarding your own MODOK, and discarding your own MODOK when your whole deck is so built to be a MODOK deck is absolutely game-losing. With all targeted discards in your hand, you know what your cards are going to hit. You know what Lady Sif is going to hit. You know what Colleen Wing is going to hit. You know what Blade is going to hit. You can set that up and you can make it happen. Now, of course, this deck also has 2 very powerful scalers in Morbius and Meek, and 1 slightly less powerful scaler in the Collector. The Collector is here just because he's okay. This is not a deck that leans fully into the Collector. He is just sort of baseline decent here. Very much a flex spot if you wanted to mess around with that. I think generally speaking, the Collector and Wolverine are the flux spots you're going to be looking at in this deck. But the issue with discard is that it's hard to really flex stuff with these lists without really changing what they're about. So this is baseline Proxima, the safest Proxima deck you can play. And I expect it to be a very safe, easy to play, logical first step for anyone who has picked up Proxima Midnight. You're basically just playing her as Big Wolverine in this deck. Your MODOK gets an extra 7 power when you play it, and you have Proxima in hand. And that's, pretty good. Like, discard probably needs more help than that, but this is undeniably a deck that was actually improved by the addition of Proxima Midnight. So here we get a little bit less safe. We add in Corvus Glaive, we add in Helicarrier. And I will say, I'm a little more sure that Helicarrier makes sense than I am that Corvus Glaive makes sense. I am very risk averse when it comes to building these discard decks. I tend to want to play the ones that have the targeted discards in them and then not risk discarding my MODOK. Because yes, discarding your MODOK is actually that bad when you are a dedicated MODOK deck. However, this is not necessarily a dedicated MODOK deck. There's overlap here between Helicarrier and the Collector. Now, I do think that I'm more sure that a good discard deck can run Helicarrier than I am that a good discard deck can run Corvus Glaive. Helicarrier is actually just straight up pretty good. You are able to do things like make sure you discard Helicarrier, get 4 cards that you can play randomly, and play them all out, and then discard the rest of your hand, which is all discard synergy cards with the MODOK. This is a thing you can actually do. You turn 3, Lady Sif a Helicarrier, turn 4, play some Helicarrier cards, turn 5, MODOK the rest of them away, you get a Swarm, you get a Proxima, you get real numbers out of that. And this is, I'm more convinced on Helicarrier than I am on Corvus Glaive. However, Proxima Midnight is almost an afterthought in this. This is a deck that is really built around that early Morbius, that early Collector. Those are the cards that are really scaling up here. And I think that generally speaking, I would be interested in trying, minus Corvus Glaive plus Meek, get another scaler in there. And then your deck is suddenly you have 3 scaling early threats. You have Proxima Midnight, who's going to come down and help whatever one of those scaling early threats needs that help the most. And you have generally just some stuff to do when the end game hits, whether that be Swarms in Apocalypse or Helicarrier cards. This is a deck that is actually putting out a reasonable amount of power. The issue it's going to run into is right now the metagame is extremely high powered. So for example, when you're playing a deck like this or the previous one, you end up in a situation where you're putting out maybe about as much power as your opponent. Maybe you're putting out a little bit less power than the average Thanos deck, a little bit less power than the average Hela deck. But you can go power to power with something like Loki or Darkhawk, right? but those decks have tech cards in them. And that means that you're in a bit of an awkward situation because you are this very straightforward deck that is not necessarily doing the most it can in terms of power. So you're going to lose the big power matchups, and you also don't have the flexibility to end up in a good situation against the tech card matchups. It's a little bit odd, right? Like, you are almost there, discard, it feels like, but Proxima Midnight isn't solving the problem discard had, which is mainly that it is a linear points deck with very limited interaction. And as a linear points deck with very limited interaction, the number one thing you need to be is the biggest, and it's not the biggest. So you end up in a situation where it's not the best deck at doing the thing that it does, which is linear points with limited interaction. And that puts it in an awkward spot. And while Proxima Midnight makes it better at doing that thing, she does not make it the best. So what does it take for this deck to actually become a big points threat? I think Wong tends to be the kind of answer that Wong, Dakin, like, you need more big dudes. That's the operative thing that is driving this change to the list, right? You can see how the deck is getting riskier and riskier in an attempt to go taller and taller. And that is mostly because, like, Thanos is going to go taller than it, Hela is going to go taller than it, and a lot of other decks that play tech cards are going to go comparably tall. So what it takes to get more tall than that is like 20 power Morbius, 17 power Collector, 15 power Meek. That's the kind of stuff you need if you want to be competing with Thanos, and that's what Wong in this deck tends to give you. Obviously, like, double MODOK, discarding, a bunch of swarms in a helicarrier, discarding all those cards again. Like, that's a lot of power on a Meek. That's a lot of power on a Collector. That's a ton of power on a Morbius. And that's sort of what this deck is built around. So while I think the other builds of this deck are safer, playing it safe means that you just end up in like 40% matchups against the best decks in the game. Like, if you are taking that discard deck against a Thanos deck, either of the two we talked about previously, you end up in a situation where the Thanos deck, if it does what it wants to do, is just going to go taller than you, and you're just going to lose. Now, you're sitting there like, all right, maybe they'll clunk, and maybe they will, but maybe you'll clunk. It's not a really reliable game plan. Whereas this, it's like, you have a coherent argument for, I'm going to put more points out than them. Is it always going to happen? No. Is it pretty finicky? Yes. But you can do it. And having that capability in your deck is mainly why I seem to like these builds. I do want to give a shout out to Ava, who is someone who really sort of pioneered these when Corvus Glaive came out. Like, I don't particularly think Corvus Glaive is all that good in it, but the rest of the deck is actually, like, legitimately solid. Like, this kind of shell has beaten me before, and Proxima Midnight is a very solid addition to it, probably a better card in it than Corvus Glaive. And so that means that I think that there is, like, something real here. Not necessarily overly real, but, like, the kind of thing that can win games for sure. Here's where we get extra weird. So I went into my group chat of, like, high infinite grinders, and I was like, guys, does anyone have, like, just some absolutely off the wall? I know someone's messing around with the weird aspects of Proxima way more than I am. And KX4N got back to me with this, which is a Moon Girl Proxima deck that is built to do a couple things, namely either extremely large Dakins, like you can get outrageously large Dakins in this deck. You can get Gambit combos. You can get multiple Wongs off of a Zabu Moon Girl. You can do things like, there's a bunch of weird combo angles in here, basically. And I will say, I did make one change. KX was playing a Nico Minoru, which I removed. I get why he was doing it, but I really wanted to make sure I had the extra power of a Morbius in here, and I think that was pretty important. However, the rest of what's happening here is legit quite good. Like, you can do stuff that your opponent... Like, the main thing that this deck does is have a range that nobody is familiar with. No one is playing anything like this, and so when you play it, your opponents have approximately no idea what you're doing. And you have very powerful options that are very, very weird and unexpected. Nobody's really expecting Wong, Gambit. That's not really a thing people are playing around, but you can do it, right? Like, and it's not like necessarily something you should do all the time, but it's something that's in your wheelhouse, right? Wong, Wong, Gambit, Gambit, pitch a couple Proxima Midnights. Like, that's real. Like, there are really strong things you can do here. Like, you are actually able to get that kind of stuff done. Now, one weakness this does have is it can't go really infinite on the Wong Gambits because we're not playing Swarm, because we're playing Moon Girl. So you end up in this awkward situation where, like, yeah, you could probably blow up, like, 6 things some of the time, 5 things some of the time, but since Gambit actually requires you to have the cards in hand now, it is a little bit worse. Still, if we have an Apocalypse there, it's going to be able to go infinite that way, but it is just Apocalypse that will let you go as large as you need with, like, double Wong stuff. Not that you're often doing that, to be clear. Now, the other thing this deck gets to do is Moon Girl your Proxima Midnights, which is pretty sick, honestly. Having multiple Proxima Midnights come down, Moon Girling them, like, that kind of thing is actually really good. So, like, for example, you go, like, Moon Girl on 3, you play Dracula on 4, you play MODOK on 5, and, like, let's say, you know, your Proxima Midnights all come down, you have 2 Apocalypses in hand, you get to play 1 Apocalypse, the other one goes to the Dracula. That's a lot of points. Like, again, like, this is the kind of thing where it's like, you have lines in this deck that you can commit to as early as turn 3, and you have a very good idea of what they look like, and your opponent has absolutely no idea of what they look like, and they are pretty heavy points lines. Now, this is, again, like most discard decks, just a points deck. It is only doing points, but it's doing it in such a weird and awkward way that it's like, okay, you know, yeah, I'm only doing points, but I'm doing points in such an unexpected way that you probably have no idea what I'm actually doing, and that kind of points deck can really catch people off guard. And I think this deck, like I said, we're getting increasingly weird. I'm not putting my weight behind all of these decks, but I am trying to give you, like, the full gamut of what Proxima Midnight can do. And it's not just discard, but it is kind of just discard, but it gets weirder and weirder. This one came from either Jimmy Dickens or Big Baby. I can't trace the genealogy back, but they were both kicking it around. And I know Big Baby was playing it as high as, like, top 5 recently. This is Loki Proxima, or really Helicarrier Loki. Like, it's a deck that's like, hey, remember when Loki was so cool with the Collector? What if we could have that back again? And one of the things that this deck is sacrificing is, you know, the inclusion of tech, the inclusion of that stuff, right? There are going to be matchups where your opponent just goes way taller than you and you don't have any tech and you just have to, like, sit there and spin your wheels and try to get there. But what this deck does that I actually like is it plays like a mid-range killer. And, you know, every Loki deck is kind of a mid-range killer, but this one's really dangerous because of the explosive power of the early turns combined with a Loki game plan in the background. Like, you can vomit out a ton of power, have a relatively full hand, play the card Loki, and really feel like you're playing old Loki, where, like, you were just ahead the entire game into playing all of their cards on 5 and 6. And that's a really hard game to lose unless your opponent is going super duper tall. Now, Proxima, is she really doing a lot in this deck? I actually think the answer is yes. It's important to get what you can out of her while you can. Like, there are going to be games where you have, like, a Proxima in hand and you're like, well, I kind of have to Loki here, and you will have to Loki her away, and that kind of sucks. Like, yeah, no, she could have been free, but I didn't get the things that I needed to make her free. And for the record, Blade is typically that thing. Like, playing to make sure that Proxima is the card that gets discarded is something you will have to do with that Blade. In addition, like, yeah, sometimes she's just a 4/7, right? Like, that's pretty cool too. Generally not going to win you games, though. Like, really what this deck is trying to do is be unfair. You want to be unfair with the Collector, it's going to be like a 2/12. You want to be unfair with Proxima Midnight, which you want to make a 0/7. And then you want to use your full hand to convert it into Loki stuff, and then you're just ahead the entire game, and you're just snowballing super hard downhill. That's pretty much how this deck wants to play. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for sticking with me for this. While I've got you here, I wanted to ask you if this is the kind of stuff you like for new cards coming out, because I have been trying to figure out exactly what to do for new card releases, how exactly to approach them, and I've been trying different things. I've been throwing it at the wall, and this is one of the things I'm throwing at the wall, just like a 15-minute rundown of, like, my 5 favorite decks with the new card. And not really a recommendation on purchasing it or not, although I will say, I'll give you that right now. I don't think she's worth buying. She's cool, but she's probably not, like, metagame impacting, and there's some really interesting stuff coming out in March, but that's just, like, my preliminary feeling. That said, I just want you guys to let me know what you think about this sort of format, because I like it. I like doing it, but I want to make sure that this kind of like Wednesday after new card release content is the kind of thing you're looking for from me. Let me know what you're looking for from me in the comments below. I will read them all. I always do. Thank you so much. I've been Cam Best. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.